Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's devotional. Our thought today is going to come from an article that was posted a couple of weeks ago and this is coming from that Mind Matters website that I referenced, or that we've kind of looked at a couple of articles before. This is actually part one, I believe, of that four-part discussion. It's actually kind of a transcript of a speech that Steve Meyer gave, and kind of talking about different aspects of the existence of God and science and different elements. We looked at the same website in, I think it was part two of this same talk, where he kind of discusses the Big Bang and things like that. But uh, yeah, I think it was the Big Bang. But this one is, if DNA is a language, who is the speaker? And philosopher Steve Meyer talks about the significance of Francis Crick's sequence hypothesis that shows that DNA is literally a language of life. Now, there's a little bit less science in this particular article. It's more kind of just descriptive of kind of what his point is, rather than delving into some of the science. But in a talk at the Dallas Conference on Science and Faith in 2021, philosopher Steve Meyer looked at the question of whether a multiverse is an multiverse of madness, or God, as in many traditions, is the origin of our universe. Multiverse, the idea of the multiverse is that there are infinite multiverses, which is to say dimensions or timelines, alternate timelines. And in infinite multiverses, the odds are that eventually one of the multiverses would get it right and produce life. It just kind of another way to try to dismiss the improbability of the fact that all things exist the way that they do, in such a way that gives us the means of life. And certainly we believe that God is the origin of our universe. That is our universe designed, as considerable evidence suggests, or is ours just one of a few lucky universes whose extra lucky conditions allow for advanced life? Dr. Meyer is the author of The Return to the God Hypothesis, which argues that the evidence from science favors God over a multiverse. And as we mentioned, this is transcripts of the talk that he gave. This is the number one. We looked at number two. So this is Stephen Meyer speaking at this conference. He says, at a previous Science and Faith conference, I had the opportunity to do an interview with Eric Metaxas about Matahas, probably, about my new book. About halfway through, he and others noticed that one of the young women who was manning the camera for the interview was weeping visibly. Later, we got a letter from the producer who had hired this young camera woman. The young woman, we'll call her Alice, had shared her story with him. She was listening to us discuss scientific evidence for the existence of God. She found herself overcome with emotion, and she told us a bit of the backstory in her letter. And this is what she said. Throughout this, so this is the young lady in this letter describing why she was weeping. Throughout my college career, professors would constantly lecture that based on the evidence they had provided, there should be no way that anyone in class could believe in God. They'd argue that science was proven, and hence God was a myth. I was not equipped to present a valid opposition in debate. I was desperate to find commonality between my beliefs and my scientific education, but could find none. And then Stephen Meyer provides some background. She graduated as a biology major with very good grades and was slated for grad school. But the constant proselytizing of atheism, contrary to her beliefs, caused her to pursue film production instead, and that was how she happened to be there that evening. And this is a picture of Stephen Meyer. So he goes on and says, there are many powerful voices in our culture today that have declared that science properly understood undermines belief in God. Many of you may remember and be aware that since about 2006, there have been a spate of books produced under the heading of the New Atheism. In fact, New Atheism is something that Doyle Moyer covers a little bit in his book on Mind Your Faith that we discussed in our adult class on Sunday mornings that we have finished. That's a particular literary genre that's become quite popular. Richard Dawkins, he's a well-known atheist, was one of the first authors to produce a book of this kind. His book was called The God Delusion, and in it Dawkins argued that, again, science properly understood undermines belief in God. He said, since the 19th century, we've known that the most powerful argument for God's existence is the design argument. Because the evidence of design is publicly accessible, it's visible to all. And so the evidence of design in nature suggested the need for a designer. But, he said, and this is again from Richard Dawkins, that was a powerful argument only until the time of Charles Darwin, who explained that appearance of design not as the product of an actual designing intelligence, but instead is the product of an undirected, unguided process that could mimic the powers of a designing intelligence. And that process, of course, was his famed idea of natural selection, acting on random variations. So Dawkins said, now we have, so Richard Dawkins, once again in his book, again being an atheist, now we have not evidence of real design, but only evidence of the appearance of design, the illusion of design. And therefore we have no evidence of a designer, and therefore no public evidence, no scientific evidence of God. So he said, you could still believe in God if you want to, but you're doing so on the basis of a kind of delusion. And so that's the title of his book, The God Delusion. Now, I do think it's interesting that Charles Darwin, it's interesting, you go back and you look at what Charles Darwin actually wrote and what he actually observed. He observed variations within species, what is commonly referred to as microevolution. Variations in dogs. You have different subspecies of dog in the sense of variations of those. The same is true for trees. The same is true for birds. I mean, you have subspecies or variations of a species within those types of forms. But Charles Darwin actually, I did not mean to do that. Charles Darwin actually, in his autobiography, he wrote this, that he was often referred to as an atheist. However, he disagreed with that categorization and said, in fact, I deserve to be called a theist because of the odds of all of this taking place and then having it such as it is, I believe to be nearly impossible. And so even Charles Darwin, even though he's referred to as the father of evolution, and atheists routinely reference him, Charles Darwin, in his own autobiography, referred to himself as a theist, a believer in a designer or a God, not necessarily Jehovah per se. Charles Darwin didn't specifically refer to Jehovah or the God of the Bible, but that he believed in a ultimate designer. So it's kind of interesting and odd that Richard Dawkins and a lot of atheists, when they refer to him, they don't include that information. So here's Meyer picking back up. Now, Dawkins has done a nice job of framing the issue. He says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect at the bottom. There is no design, no purpose, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. In other words, so here's Stephen Meyer speaking, the universe we observe is consistent with what philosophers call a materialistic worldview. Doy Moyer refers to this as naturalistic worldview in his book, so it's the same concept. There's only matter and energy. There's only matter and energy are the things from which everything else comes. It also means that nature itself explains its own existence, that it should be able to explain its own creation, its own sustainability, and all that. There's no purpose of intelligence behind the universe whatsoever. And he again quotes Richard Dawkins, and the properties of the universe, Dawkins says, are exactly what we would expect if that kind of a materialistic universe was in fact the case. And so Stephen Meyer once again picks up, I want to argue that no, it's not. I focused on just one discovery. In the foundation of life, every living cell, every living organism, there is a molecule that contains digital code. Code for producing the really important protein molecules that keep cells alive. And that molecule, of course, is DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Its structure was first elucidated in 1953, or theorized or hypothesized, I guess you could say, in 1953 by James Watson and Francis Crick. It kind of shown to be elucidated, means kind of shown to be a possibility or discussed, and I actually think they ended up doing because Watson and Crick are both credited with the discovery of DNA. And remember from biology class, they showed that DNA has this beautiful double helix structure. And in the interior of the molecule, there are four chemicals called bases. And in 1953, they suggested that this molecule might be capable of carrying information in a digital or alphabetic form. In 1957 and 58, Francis Crick proposed what he called the sequence hypothesis. And this hypothesis was, if anything, more significant than the original discovery of the double helix structure. The sequence hypothesis proposed that the four chemical bases called nucleotides function like alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code, like the zeros and ones that we'd use in software today. And in fact, our local hero here in Seattle area, Bill Gates, has said that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever devised. Now, to build life, you need code, just as you need new information to build a new program or operating system on your computer. Digital information has to be present in the DNA in order to build the proteins that service the types of cells that are present. Well, where did it come from? In my book, this is Stephen Meyer speaking, in my book, Signature in the Cell, I argued that the origin of the information that's necessary to new life forms of life is best explained by designing intelligence. Why? Well, think of that quote from Bill Gates again, about the DNA is like a software program. Programs come from programmers. In fact, whenever we see information and we trace it back to its source, whether we're talking about a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or a section of code, a software code in a computer program, or even information embedded in a radio signal, when you trace that information back to a source, you always come to a mind, not a material process. And this is actually very similar to the point that Dwayne Moyer makes in talking about the source of information, that information doesn't come about by chance, by just random possibility. Information is actually generated, it's created from design. And the fact that there's so much information in DNA, it is so complex. The possibility of it having come about naturally, information has to come from somewhere. The design of a programming such as DNA had to come from somewhere. And that's the thought process that Stephen Meyer is bringing up. And it's an interesting question because a number of scientists have actually suggested that the condition on the early Earth, they were so incompatible to life forming spontaneously through a series of chemical reactions that they've proposed that life might have been seeded here. It should be, I think even though it's transcribed, it should be seeded, S-E-E-D-E-D, here from outer space by effectively a space alien. Which I think is really funny that some of these scientists are going so far as to suggest that space aliens actually seeded life on our planet to explain away the inconsistencies and near impossibilities of it having originated naturally. Double helix discoverer Francis Crick was sympathetic to this view, and astronomer Fred Hoyle espoused a similar view. Now, I've never been persuaded by this space alien designer hypothesis, and he actually gives a brilliant reason why. For one thing, it raises the question, where did the information come from to build the space alien? Okay, so you're going to argue that the space alien seeded life on Earth. So where did the information for what presumably had designed the alien in DNA, where did that information come from? So if you're going to argue that, well, what's the origin of the space alien? You know, it's the kind of the chicken or the egg type of thing. In the end, it still goes back to some design, no matter how you go at that. But there's a deeper reason to be skeptical about the idea that the designing intelligence is responsible for life is an immanent intelligence in the cosmos. And oh yeah, that was part two. Was the super intellect monkeyed with our universe's physics? It wasn't the Big Bang. That was a different article. It was super intellect monkeyed with our universe's physics. And so that leads into the second part. And so there's a deeper reason to be skeptical about the idea and so forth. He goes into the broad physics of the universe, which is a previous, what was that, from last week before last, uh, uh, devotional that we did. But I thought this was really, really interesting uh, discussion that Stephen Meyer provides about DNA, especially the concept of where that information came from. That even scientists who are atheists or have a materialistic or naturalistic worldview are having difficulty explaining that particular concept, so much so that they're reverting to the idea that, well, maybe an alien seeded life on Earth, and that explains where all this came from. Which is to say that to them, it makes more sense and is more reasonable and logical to believe in some advanced space alien that planted life here as opposed to believing in God. That's how far they're willing to go. Now, granted, I mean, the idea of advanced aliens seeding life on other planets, that's a science fiction trope at this point. Star Trek has it. I mean, there's all kinds of sci-fi that includes the concept of seeding of life by advanced beings. Stargate has the same concept. But ultimately, that's really what they're describing is science fiction. And by science fiction, meaning there is absolutely no scientific basis upon which to base that thought. There's no other basis to base that belief either. Ultimately, that is truly a blind belief. Talk about grasping at straws to explain a problematic issue that they have in dealing with the existence of DNA and other incongruities that they've come across, not being able to explain them, rather than accepting eyewitness testimony regarding Jesus, regarding the resurrection, the fact that Jesus himself referenced creation. When he was asked about marriage, he said, in the beginning, God made them male and female. Jesus himself references Genesis 1 and 2. And that fact speaks to the validity, the accuracy of the record of Genesis 1 and 2. That God created the male and female. God created the heavens and the earth. And of course, and we noticed this particular passage as well when we looked at the concept of the Big Bang. We looked at an article dealing with and it was from Mind Matters. That's why I got mixed up. It was from the Mind Matters website we read that article also on the Big Bang and how the James Webb Space Telescope has created some major issues for a lot of atheists because the stuff that it's picturing and showing and things, it's a lot of that information they're getting is kind of blowing up the Big Bang, pun intended, in terms of its validity and possibility of explaining everything. So now they're having to go back to the drawing board to figure it out. But we like I said, we read this particular passage from Romans chapter 1, and in verse 18, verse 16 and 17, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. It's the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. And then in verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, such as there is no God. It's all natural and materialistic. It all takes care of itself, and there is no God because of that. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. And again, I want to suggest that verse 19 and 20, that what he's describing, what Paul's describing, while yes, it can certainly be applied, that what we see around us in terms of nature, what we see in trees and the beauty of the cosmos and the physics, as was referred to earlier, the fact that all the things are just right, everything's so finely tuned for us, and the odds of that being the case are so astronomical, pun intended again. Certainly that is one application of this, but I suggest that when Paul refers to what may be known of God is manifest It's not manifest to them, although it is. God's power, God's nature is shown in the creation of the universe, certainly. It is manifest in us, as in what may be known of God can be seen in human beings. For God has shown it to us. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. In terms of his power and his creativity in nature, certainly. But notice that this is referenced being understood by the things that are made. Well, trees can't understand anything that we know of. Birds, I don't think, can understand much. Okay, grass can't understand stuff. So who's he talking about having understanding? It's us, being understood by what things? We're the things. Even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they, who's they, are without excuse. Trees aren't going to stand before Christ in judgment. Mountains aren't going to stand before Christ in judgment. People are going to stand. Souls are going to stand before Christ in judgment. And it's to that Paul's referring here in verse 20. And that importance of understanding, yes, all of creation certainly does speak to God's power and his creativity and his wisdom and knowledge and so forth. But within us is even the evidence of that power and creativity. Certainly the fact that we, as you know, we believe we have souls, although there are many people who don't believe we do. But I wonder if Paul, for instance, in describing or in considering the design of man, that God's power can be seen. And that certainly speaks to certainly the presence of DNA. And how that we are so wonderfully made, as a wise man once said, that the understanding of the machine of man, that God created us in this way, to have this form, and to be able to be allowed us to eventually be able to discover things like DNA, to discover things like the fact that those same nucleonic building blocks exist in nature. Okay, trees have DNA. All organic things have DNA. They're just arranged differently. And man, certainly being perhaps the most, obviously, the most complicated, most advanced form of all of that. And the fact that people believe that all of this happened naturally, and all this information just randomly came into being and then generated all of these life forms. That's their belief. Again, based on absolutely nothing. We have eyewitness testimony. We have what we believe to be the Word of God, that God gave us to explain these things. And yet you have scientists basing their entire belief not on evidence, but on extrapolation and assumption from evidence that does nothing to speak against the existence of God. They then extrapolate and justify their belief that there isn't one. All right, that's the Daily Devotional for you today. Just a thought from that website. I think it's a really interesting read about DNA and kind of the and even before that understanding or the reference that was made earlier about this young lady who she acknowledged the fact that she was not in a situation or she wasn't equipped to be able to argue against some of these teachers that were telling her that you would be stupid to believe in God. And I wonder, and I hope certainly that our young people don't find themselves in the same situation, that we equip them, certainly God's Word does, to equip them to understand what valid opposition would be. And this is part of the reason why we went through the book Mind Your Faith by Dwayne Moyer, and one of the reasons we have these daily devotionals. Is that certainly our young people are facing this very same thing, that there should be no way that anyone in class could believe in God. They're having to deal with the very same constant proselytizing of atheism. And we have to be obviously prepared for that and be prepared with a response. Okay? Scientists cannot recreate macroevolution. They cannot prove it by any stretch. That macroevolution is that one species can evolve or turn into a different or new species. There is nothing to show that, nothing to prove that. They have bones that they extrapolate to be this or that, but they don't actually have evidence of it. They can't reproduce it. They can't recreate it, much less Big Bang or a lot of this other stuff that they come up with. All right. Our next daily devotional or devotional will be tomorrow at 6:30. Hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.